Let me ask you a question. Do you ever feel like you're always firefighting? Not literally, but you know the feeling. There's always another crisis, another emergency, another animal, another situation that can't wait. You're reacting constantly to whatever is the most urgent thing in front of you. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that there are other things that you should probably be doing. Important things that might actually make a difference in the long run. But you can never quite get to them because there's always more fires to put out. Does that sound familiar? Because if it does, this framework is for you. I'm Harry Eckman, Global Advisor for Cat Population Management and International Cat Care. And through our work, we kept noticing something across very different contexts. That organisations that were struggling often couldn't say why they were struggling. The answer was always some version of needing more. We need more funding, we need more staff, we need more support. And that wasn't exactly wrong, but it also wasn't a diagnosis. It was what filled the gap when there hadn't been the time or the space to actually do the diagnosing. Because the conditions of this work, that firefighting, don't allow much room for that kind of looking. You're responding, you're managing, you're keeping things moving. The question of what's actually driving the pressure always gets pushed to the edges. And when it does come up, the pieces always look separate. It's a staffing problem, it's a retention problem, it's a capacity problem, it's a partnership that isn't quite working. And each one of those things is handled on its own. What this framework does is it says that those things aren't separate, they're connected, and that there's a shape to how they connect. And the thing is, anyone who's spent any real time in this sector has seen all of these things. The program that falls apart when one person leaves, or the strategy that's built on goodwill that eventually ran out, or the partnership that looked really solid on paper and turned out to rest on two people who just got on well and then one of them left. And we've all seen it, and some of us might have been the person holding it all together. But what we realised was that there was no shared language for this. There was no specific lens to look through that would enable us to clearly see which of these situations we were actually in right now. So that's what this framework is. It's that lens, that way of looking at and understanding what kind of work is needed by asking the questions that most of us probably already know we should be asking, but the pace of work makes it really hard to stop and actually ask them. Now, the framework is built around 8 stages, but they're not really stages in the typical sense because they're not a sequence to work through. They're more like moments where the questions you ask matter the most. And then the stages themselves are built inside 3 phases: understanding, grounding, and sustaining. But again, they aren't steps. They're more like just different kinds of territory. So looking at them in turn, understanding, that first phase, is about making sense of what's actually happening before deciding what to do about it. And within that, the stages are the first one, the catalyst, and that's the moment where you just acknowledge that something isn't working. Following that, there's the moment where you look at understanding the problem and then just begin to make sense of what's happening. And then there's the moment where you look for better clarity on what you're trying to change. That's defining the goal. The next phase is grounding. That's about moving into action in a way that the system, your system or situation, can actually support. The stages in here are the moment where you have to be honest about what you can actually do right now. That's what your capacity is and what your constraints are. Then there's the moment where you try and decide where to work and what comes first, and then work out the order of all the things that then need to follow. And then there's the moment where you need to work out if what you're doing is actually working and if it's helping to address the problem that you'd identified by starting small and learning, and so you grow and evolve. And then lastly, there's the sustaining phase, and that's about making sure that all the progress that you've made up until now doesn't just unravel once the initial energy fades. And so the stages here are the moment where you look at making the work that you've been doing more sustainable by adjusting it and scaling your efforts. And then there's the moment where you recognize those wider, bigger shifts as a result of your efforts and actually seeing the impact of all of those changes. Now, I'm not going to walk you through all of these 8 stages, but what I do want to do is take you through just 3 of them, one from each phase, just to let you see what they actually feel like from the inside. So let's start with stage 1, that moment where the thing that was manageable, or rather being managed, started to become unmanageable or unsustainable. And what we kept finding was that this moment when people acknowledged that something wasn't working was almost always much later than the moment where everybody actually already knew that something was wrong. But the pressure had crept in gradually, so people absorbed it and they adapted, and then at some point they just stopped noticing. For example, imagine a shelter that's been operating above capacity for 6 months, and it might have absorbed all of that pressure so gradually that it no longer registered as a crisis, and it simply became the way things are until something became unsustainable. And that's what stage 1 is really about, that moment of naming the problem, because until you name it, you can't really do anything about it. And that's the first of the 3 key questions. What's happening that feels unsustainable, and how long has it actually been like this? Now, within each stage, there's 3 questions to help make sense of your situation and decide where to focus. Now, and all 3 matter, and answering them will give you a clearer picture of where you are and what that stage requires. But within each set of 3, there's one question that does something slightly different, and it points to where change is most likely or possible. And that's the leverage point. That's the question that helps you identify where a focused effort is most likely to shift something. The second question in this stage is, who's feeling the effect the most, and are those people in the conversation yet? The people closest to the problem aren't always the people closest to the decision making. For example, imagine a TNR program that may have been designed by a welfare organisation but without any meaningful input from the community actually living alongside those cats. And then there's the third question in stage 1, and this one here is the leverage question. Is this a one-off situation, or is it a pattern that the system keeps producing? Now, if it's a one-off, then it's an issue that should be resolvable. But if it's a pattern, if the same problems keep returning despite all of your efforts, then something in the environment or the system that you're working in is producing it. And understanding where this is coming from is where lasting change begins. For example, imagine a vaccination campaign that fell short of its targets in one area because there was a storm. Now that's exceptional circumstances, that's a one-off. But a campaign that consistently fails to reach the same communities and the same areas across multiple rounds of vaccination attempts is probably going to be dealing with access and trust barriers that those logistical adjustments aren't going to be able to overcome. We're now going to jump to stage 4 to give an example of something in the grounding phase. So think of a plan or an initiative that your organisation has committed to in the last, say, year or 2. And then ask yourself honestly, was it based on the capacity you actually had, or the capacity that you hoped you'd have? Because one of the things that we saw was that organisations often making plans based on conditions that didn't quite exist yet. Not because they were being careless, but it was out of optimism and it was out of the pressure that they were feeling. In most organisations, a big part of what holds things together is goodwill. It's those informal arrangements. It's people doing more than they should because they care. For example, imagine just expanding a community project without actually acknowledging that the member of staff most qualified to lead the work is already operating well beyond their capacity. And expanding it depends entirely on their ongoing willingness to take on even more. And that's what this stage is really about. Not whether the work is worth doing, but whether the conditions exist to do it sustainably. So in stage 4, the first question is the leverage question. What is this system actually running on? And how much of it is goodwill and informal arrangements and 1 or 2 people just doing too much? And here it's not to assign blame or suggest that people carrying too much should just stop. It's to make your situation in the system visible so that the decisions about what to do next are based on how things actually work rather than how they're supposed to work. Now the second question is, what would break first if we added more pressure? For example, let's imagine a TNR program that's already managing way more colony sites than it could comfortably support, and then you just add some additional sites, even though the project is already stretched. Identifying what will break first isn't a reason to avoid moving forward, but it is a way of deciding what needs to be strengthened or protected before adding more pressure. And then that leads nicely into question 3, which is what needs to be in place or protected before committing to anything new. And the answer here isn't always about adding new things. Sometimes it's just about protecting what already exists, formalizing what's currently informal, or slowing down long enough to build the foundations for whatever comes next. And lastly, we're going to jump to stage 7 and the sustaining phase. So let me ask you this. If the person most responsible for holding a piece of work together left tomorrow, or your grant funding ended, or a friendly informal arrangement that you had was really pressure tested, what would actually survive? Not on paper, but actually survive. For example, imagine a cat population management program that was developed with a friendly, sympathetic mayor. And then you find after the election that the new administration less willing to fund the work. So what used to feel like municipal support was actually just one person, the mayor, being enthusiastic. That's what stage 7 is really about. What happens when early progress starts to work? Not whether to continue it, but how to make continuing it scalable and sustainable. So the first question in this stage is what's working? And does it work because it's well designed or because a few people are making it work through sheer effort? And distinguishing between what works because of good design and what works because of exceptional people isn't about diminishing the contribution of those people. It's just about understanding what would need to change for the work to continue if they weren't there anymore. And here in this stage, the second question is the leverage question. What would happen to this if the person holding it together left tomorrow? For example, imagine an advocacy organisation whose coalition partners are all working well together, and they might find that those relationships exist almost entirely because of one staff member's efforts. And if that person left, there would be very little to hand over and everything to rebuild in that coalition. And then there's the last question. What needs to be clarified, shared, or formalized before building anything else on top of it? And the thing is, things that need to be documented and shared or formalized are often the things that feel the least urgent because the people who manage them are still there, still making them work, right up until the moment where maybe they leave. So you've now hopefully had a bit of a taste of how this framework works, and I imagine the question you're asking is, so how do I use it? Where do I start? And the truth is, people are going to come to this framework from very different places. Might be some people in the middle of a crisis who need it, while other people might have been doing this work for years and are trying to understand why progress feels harder than it should. And this framework isn't intended to be worked through from beginning to end. You don't need to start at stage 1 and then work through all 8 stages in sequence. If a thing feels urgent and reactive, sure, yeah, go to stage 1 and identify what's not working. But if you feel like change is needed, but nobody can really say what, well then you'd go to stage 3 and define the goal. Or if lots is happening, but your progress feels like it's really short-lived, well then you go to stage 5 and find the right order of things to do. What matters is starting from where you are and where your situation actually is, not where you think you should be. Truth is, we know there's always going to be fires that need to be put out. That's just the nature of this kind of work. But the framework is a way of looking at and understanding what kind of work is needed by asking the right questions at the right times. And I hope that this is a very useful tool. If you'd like to learn more about the framework and see how it could apply to your context or help your organisation, then please email me at harryeckman@icatcare.org. And to help us develop this further, please scan the QR code and fill out a short survey about this framework. And thank you.